I hope that my talk will also shed some light about the past role and potential future role of big business in these crises from my perspective as the Executive Director of CorpWatch. I would like to begin with a story of my teenage years, just outside the town of Kurseong, some 5,000 feet above sea level in the Darjeeling foothills, a region famous across the world for its tea. A couple of times a year, when I was in school, we went for hikes and picnics in these tea estates. I still have fond memories of swimming in the mountain streams and taking tours of the tea factories. As we hiked, we would come across estate workers walking up the hills, bent double under the weight of the tea that they had gathered in baskets almost as big as themselves. So it was with regret that I learned earlier this year that annual tea production in the region has fallen from 16 million kilograms 13 years ago to about 18 million kilograms in 2020. As a result, the 67,000 temporary and permanent workers in the tea estates of the Darjeeling Hills, 60% of whom I should add are women, on daily wages of 200 rupees, a little more than $2 a day, are facing job losses. Why is this? The answer is simple: climate change. Temperatures have risen by 0.5 degrees Celsius, rainfall has declined and become more erratic, which has hugely impacted the growing of tea. Scientists estimate that the maximum safe threshold of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is 350 parts per million. For most of human history, that level has been about 275. In 1988, it passed the magic 350 mark. Today, it stands at well over 410 parts per million. And if you add in other greenhouse gases, the number is now 504. In other words, we have passed the point of no return. So whose fault is this? Is it ours for driving, for flying, for using plastic? Could we have produced energy a different way? Well, of course, solar energy and wind power are two examples, even if we can't yet produce them at scale. But if the trillions, yes, the trillions of dollars that have been spent on oil and gas exploration had been spent on developing storage batteries and the like, we would not be in this fix. So let me spell out whose fault this is. It is Exxon, Indian Oil, Shell, and dozens of other companies. And what's worse, they knew. In July 1977, Exxon's senior scientist, James Black, addressed the company management committee to tell them that global warming was inevitable. That year is significant to me, at least, because that is exactly when, as a teenager, I played on those tea estates in Darjeeling. It was over a decade before the world would pass the safe level of 350 parts per million of carbon. So they had a warning and they had time to act, but they didn't. So I'd like to fast forward now 15 years to the early 1990s. As a young reporter, I attended the 2-year negotiations of the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development that culminated with the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, in June 1992. That's the subject of my first book, The Earth Brokers. It was attended by more heads of state than ever before. George Bush Sr. was there, Fidel Castro was there, and many others. There were also citizen groups from around the world. And of course, there was a third group of people, senior executives from some 200 big businesses like DuPont, Shell, and Mitsubishi, who made up the Business Council for Sustainable Development, who attended to water down any binding agreements that might limit their profits. Out of that meeting came many accords, most of which are no longer the topic of global debate, except one, the Climate Change Convention. Most of you are probably aware of this convention because of the huge media coverage it generates at the annual conference of the parties, most recently in Glasgow. But few remember the original goals of the convention, which was simply to arrest greenhouse gas emissions at 1990 levels. Today, almost 30 years later, despite all the hot air from governments, we have not achieved those goals. No, instead, we are levels approximately 47% higher than in 1990. And we are already witnessing the results. Not just the loss of tea production and jobs, but unprecedented heat waves, catastrophic flooding, and the sinking of entire islands. Why is this? Did those governments in Rio fail to stop climate change? Or did we, the individuals who populate this planet, cause it? Well, as the well-known economist Jeffrey Sachs once said, the fault lies with the modern corporation. Companies like DuPont, Exxon, Shell, and Mitsubishi, which are based on limited liability and profit. Actually, he didn't use the word profit. His precise phrase was limited liability and greed. It is not an incidental part of the modern economy, he said. It is the very essence. Today, multinational companies are more powerful than national governments that negotiate conventions in Rio or Glasgow, and they determine how much people get paid and what toxics pollute our air and water. CEOs and boards of directors have far more power than politicians and parliaments. Yet ordinary citizens have little say or control over these companies, and there is no opportunity to vote them out. These multinational companies extract raw materials from countries with the weakest rules, like BP, whose oil drilling polluted the Gulf of Mexico. They report their profits in tax havens like Ireland, where they pay little to nothing in public dues, like Apple or Google. And they employ workers in countries with the lowest wages, like H&M in Bangladesh. Let me dwell for a moment on labor. I opened my talk describing the tea estate, but workers. Well, the low wages, long hours, and abuse are not just on tea plantations. It has been the hallmark of corporate power for centuries, from the factories of East India Company to the slaves who worked the cotton plantations of the American South. It is still true for garment workers in Bangladesh, Cambodia, Kuwait, migrant workers in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, agricultural workers from Guatemala and Mexico working in the fields of California and Florida. To this list today, we must now add the expanding global unskilled and semi-skilled workforce employed to service Silicon Valley's online apps like Amazon and Uber. These gig workers are denied basic employment rights like minimum wages, guaranteed hours, overtime payment, union support, unemployment benefits, maternity leave. Sexual assault, occupational injuries, and illnesses are common complaints. And data on those jobs are beginning to emerge. In the UK, for example, some 2.8 million people, 9% of workforce, were gig workers last year. Of that number, a quarter were paid below national minimum wage. 1 in 10 Amazon employees in the US state of Ohio needs government assistance to make ends meet. This is despite the fact that since 2014, the state of Ohio has given Amazon over $125 million in subsidies to expand. So this problem of poverty is not confined to Darjeeling or India, but it is rising rapidly even in the industrialized West. Now, if we can't guarantee basic employment rights like minimum wage and maternity leave to our sisters and brothers, what chance do we have of taking on global climate change? But you're not here just to learn about environmental crisis or poverty. I hope that you, especially the students and alumni of the Indian Institute of Management, would like to know what you can do about it. So let me tell you another story. A little over 30 years ago, as a young reporter, I went to interview an economist in Seoul, South Korea by the name of Byung-Nak Song. Mr. Song was considered by many as the architect of the Korean economic miracle. He told me that the government encouraged the creation of successful industrial mega conglomerates in order to save the Korean people from abject poverty that followed the war. And so I asked, how did you ensure that only successful businesses would succeed? Simple, said Mr. Song. We looked at the ones that would not succeed, would not make it, and we sent in the accountants. Sometimes it took them a year, and eventually we could always find some financial problems that allowed us to shut them down. Now, of course, they didn't shut down companies like Daewoo or Hyundai or Samsung because, however corrupt, the purpose was to increase revenue and feed as many people as possible. Now, I want to be quite clear. I don't recommend South Korea's system of command capitalism as a solution, but I do think that Byung-Nak Song's methods bear thinking about. Why don't we send in the accountants? I want to tell you of the work of Paul Holden, who works for Shadow World International. It's an NGO in London on whose board I sit. For the last 2 years, he's been digging through the financial statements of a number of state enterprises in South Africa. Paul has been able to uncover evidence of 49 billion rand, that's roughly $3 billion US dollars, that had been stolen from the taxpayer. 1/3 of that was traced to businesses of the Gupta brothers, whom you may have heard of. They're from Uttar Pradesh. The same goes for a man by the name of Stuart Bowen, a lawyer from Washington, D.C., who worked for George Bush and Dick Cheney's presidential transition team. As you might guess, he was not a radical, let alone a liberal. During the US war of occupation, he was appointed to look into the books of the companies rebuilding Iraq, a topic I have written 2 books about, Iraq Inc. and Halliburton's Army. I went personally to Iraq 4 times to visit the reconstruction projects, and I interviewed Bowen and his team on a number of occasions. My first-hand stories describe the absolute failure of these projects, from schools to hospitals to roads. But what his staff uncovered was nothing short of mind-blowing. By examining the books and auditing the failures, he identified waste of $1.5 billion and was able to convict 83 individuals. Now, can we do the same for the oil companies? Can we send in the accountants to trace who they bribed to get the contracts, how they broke environmental rules? I can't, but you, the students and the alumni of the Indian Institute of Management, who will one day run some of the biggest businesses in India and in the world, will have the power to do what Paul Holden and Stuart Bowen have done. So here's my advice. When you go back to work or when you start your new jobs, don't just listen to shareholders or even your customers. Go into the accounts department and the purchasing department and make friends with them. Ask them what they know. Ask them where the bodies are buried, and you might come across some extremely valuable information that can be used to hold big business accountable. That's your task as current and future managers. Now, of course, not everyone will be able to uncover billions of dollars in corruption, but there is something that every one of you as current and future managers can do. Go and talk to the staff at the bottom of the rung in your company, the janitors and the assembly line workers, and ask them about their lives, their hopes, their dreams, and ask them what you can do for them, not just your shareholders, not just your customers. So here's another little anecdote that I hope you will find useful. Back in 1983, a newly elected general secretary of the student union at the Christian Medical College in Vellore, Tamil Nadu, decided to do just that. His union was in charge of the student cafeteria, and so he asked the workers, who were known as Thambis, which is Tamil for little brothers, how much they were paid. The answer was shocking. By way of context, adult laborers in Vellore at the time were paid 3 rupees a day, or a little more. But the youngest of these child laborers were paid just 5 rupees a month. Indeed, even the cook was paid just 30 rupees a month. And if a single dish or teacup broke in the cafeteria, the money was deducted from their pay. At the end of the month, these Thambis earned basically nothing. There was an official way to deal with this: petition the student body for a salary increase, which would probably have gone nowhere. Instead, the student doctor did something unprecedented. He took a paper from his letterhead and he doubled their salaries. Then he tried to double it again, but the student body found out and stopped him. You can imagine their fury and the fact that they realized that they could not do anything about it without invoking a huge scandal. When each of you become managers, perhaps you could follow his lead. But back to big business. Allow me to tell you one final story, that of my closest friend. This friend, I would like to say, is a truly global citizen. My friend was conceived in Northern California. My friend's ancestors were from the cobalt mines of the Congo, and my friend's midwives were tens of thousands of workers in Shenzhen, China. My friend doesn't carry an American passport, a Congolese one, or a Chinese one, but an Irish one. Behold my closest companion who travels with me everywhere, the iPhone, one of over 1 billion citizens of the powerful nation that is Apple. This nation has an annual revenue bigger than any other on earth. Indeed, its revenue is greater than that of 100 countries. This global citizen enjoys rights that few others do. No one from Somalia or Fiji, or for that matter from Western Europe or North America, enjoys the free passage that my iPhone does to every corner of the world, probably even into North Korea. And because of its citizenship and its legal domicile, my friend pays almost no taxes. Indeed, the country of Ireland has gone to court to fight for Apple's right not to pay taxes. So what can we learn from the global rights that this global citizen enjoys? Well, we've already talked about how Apple is a bad global citizen because it takes advantage of weak environmental laws in the Congo and weak workers' rights in China and weak tax laws in Ireland. But at the same time, it is also a powerful symbol of how multinational rules have transcended national ones. Embedded in this iPhone or an Android phone are examples of a system of global protocols that these companies follow strictly. For my American phone to work in Japan, where I live, it needs to have a unique number to connect to local mobile towers. The phone companies have agreed on this common system of numbers that uniquely identify each of our phones. They must also agree on a single system of broadcast wavelengths, a single system of communication protocols. Apple could go its own way and it could establish its own numbering system, pick its own communication systems and wavelengths, but that would be pointless. The system works because it is in everyone's interest to share these common global rules. Can we use a similar system of common global rules to audit and keep track of multinational companies and stop abuse? There is an NGO in Bangalore named Mahiti, which created a system to track doctors who were missing from their posts in rural India. What they did was to paint a phone number on the clinic. Any passerby could send a text message to report if the doctor was present or not. Believe me, those doctors started coming into work. The system could be audited at any time, and their services could be terminated by the government if they did not show up. While this might seem like a technological fix, it is really about creating a set of simple rules, simple systems, and empowering local people and managers to hold the powerful accountable. I think that such a system could be used to overcome the limitations of national laws and national regulations. We, civil society, especially you as students and graduates of the Indian Institute of Management, can work to gather comprehensive data on environmental and human rights abuse, fraud and waste, tax dodging and political influence in multinational companies that is often hard to track down in any single country, let alone all the countries they operate in. And that is what we are beginning to build at CorpWatch, a new database of global corporate wrongdoing. We call it Gulliver, and you can see it on our website. In this database, we upload relevant articles, reports, and violation data. You can pull out your mobile phone, type in the name of a company, and instantly get a record of their abuses. In the hands of procurement managers and auditors, we hope that this will be a powerful way to hold multinational companies in check. So in closing, when you take a break after my talk, perhaps to take a sip of tea from the estates of my childhood in Darjeeling, I invite you to send me data that will help all of us in the task of holding big business to account. Thank you.